Hello all. If you're there, I can hardly see you. Today we've brought along a variational pragmatics paper, and you'll probably be aware that variational pragmatics is interested in systemic pragmatic differences between speakers of different varieties of a language. Pragmatic research there's been quite a lot of pragmatic research on various varieties of English, also on Irish English. And when we've looked at Irish English pragmatics, we've mostly looked at Irish English versus English English or American English. And predominantly people have looked at pragmatic markers, at question tags, and at speech acts, stuff like apologies, offers, responses to thanks or requests. We find that when we look at Irish English in comparison to other varieties of English, Irish English is even more fond of indirect approaches and uses particularly few face threats to speakers as they speak. So while people might ask somebody to do something, so we have a speaker addressing a hearer to do something for them, you might say something like, could I borrow your notes? Particularly if you're a speaker of British English, arguably that is perhaps something you would say. You would use a mitigator, could, to be even more polite. And this is very important because asking somebody to do something is of course a face threat to them, so we want politeness-sensitive markers. Arguably, however, Irish English likes to be even more polite than this, and you would probably be more likely to say something like, I was wondering if I could borrow your notes. Situationally, contextually dependent, of course. So we find even higher levels of indirectness in Irish English than we do in many other varieties of English. Here with what we call an external marker, I was wondering, adding an extra level of politeness, and then the could borrow or if clause, if I could borrow, as a further politeness markers. So if clauses, past tense, and further extensions function as syntactic downgraders, which makes things more polite still. Now, we've already said there has been a good bit of research. There's also been some comparative research. There has been some research on the comparison of English English and Irish English. There has also been some research on the comparison of Irish English and Scottish English, not yet as much as there should be, we feel. And one thing that has been investigated is the potential influence of Scots or Scottish English on Northern Irish English by yours truly, John Kirk. What we would like to do is we would like to expand more on what the interrelations are on Northern Irish English and Scottish English in particular. So we want to analyze the use of directives in Northern Irish English, Southern Irish English, and Scottish English. We find a very severe research gap there. So Christina had the brilliant idea to look at data from Southern Ireland, and I did a study on that a couple of years back on how directives are used in Southern Irish English, and I worked on the Spice Island corpus for that. And I looked at how often people use more direct or less direct strategies. And it will not come as a surprise to anyone here that I found that by and large people are quite fond of using rather more indirect strategies under many circumstances. Now, and this is where we come in today, because we wanted to see how Northern Irish English and Scottish English compare to this language use in Southern Irish English. And after this brief introduction, we'll show you our classification of requests. We speak about data and methodology, our findings, and the conclusion. Our strategies are classified basically according to a scheme that goes back a long way to Bloom-Kulka and her co-authors. And then Jeffrey Leach updated this classification scheme in 2014. And this is what we are adopting here. So Jeffrey Leach says there are direct strategies like imperatives or like performatives, adding a performative verb to this. And then a bit more polite than the direct strategies are what we call on-record indirect strategies. These can come across as statements, things like, you will just fill out that work ticket, where somebody assumes that you're going to do it. Or you can be obliged to do something. You must record testing times. Or something can be phrased as a wish. I want you to bend your knees. Or it can be phrased as ability or possibility. You can hang out, you may hang out, I may hang out. So these are politer. And even more polite, arguably, are suggestions. Yeah, why don't you get those fine ones? Then we can also be indirect by using questions. Would you like to explain to us? Or could you explain to us? Then, a slightly difficult category for various reasons, non-sentential strategies. According to Jeffrey Leach, these are mainly verbless clauses. These are very situationally dependent. For example, if you're in a pub and say another pint, the barman will know what you're looking for, or another cup, please, or at the customs, passport, please. Can be understood in situational context. Or if clauses, particularly if they're incomplete, can also be non-sentential. Okay, and then you can also be even more indirect and you can use hints, which your interlocutor can decode. As in, you have left the kitchen in a right mess. Would obviously never happen to any of yous, but we can understand what is meant. Or, are you going to the train station? You couldn't possibly give me a lift, could you? Right, so these can be decoded. Then these statements can be modified further, and we can use pragmatic modifiers which mitigate the situation even further. There are external modifiers which we're not so concerned with for this particular course talk. Here we're only looking at internal modifiers. These modifiers make your sentence longer, more complex to process. But they also make your request more oblique, hence more polite. This, I was wondering if you could, rather than just give me your notes. Yeah. So these could be downtoners, for example. These could be politeness markers. Please, would you please? They can be deliberative, appreciative, or hedged performance openings, like we see the I wonder and so on. Past tense use, of course. Could you is, of course, much more polite than can you, or progressive aspect, I was wondering, and tag questions, will you, okay. So, and this is what we are going to start, what we started from.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll now say a few words about the data that we used and our methodology. So for our study, we first of all followed up on Patricia's study from 2022, and she used the ICE corpus, which was pragmatically annotated, the Spice Ireland corpus, but only looking at Southern Irish English. And then we complemented it by Northern Irish data and Scottish data. And the good thing about the ICE corpora is that they all follow the same design principles. So ideally and theoretically, they are, fully comparable, and they contain the same written and spoken genres and have the same distribution. They all total up to 1 million words, and they have the same distribution between written and spoken texts and interactions, and with more focus on the spoken data, where we get 600,000 words. So as I have already mentioned, there is Spice Ireland. That's the only ICE corpus that has been pragmatically annotated by John and Jeffrey Callan, and it is the spoken component of ICE Ireland that is annotated. For our purposes, so the annotation is more comprehensive, but we are interested in the speech act annotation. And here the annotation follows Searle's categories, the 5 categories that you see here: representatives, directives, commissives, expressives, and declaratives. And we were interested, of course, in the directives. And each text in all the ICE corpora contains around 2,000 words, right? So we have the same number of texts, and that totals up to the 1 million words. And this is, of course, also the case in Spice Ireland. And what also makes it really handy for our purposes is that we have the Southern Irish component, but we have an equal number of texts across the different categories for Northern Irish English. So we do have those two: Spice Roy, Spice NI. Then there's ICE Scotland, which is much younger, right? A more recent project than ICE Ireland, being compiled by Ulrike Gut and Ole Schützler, and still being under compilation, so it is not fully published. Some parts are available. Other parts that I have also used for this presentation are not publicly available yet, so I basically got them from the compilers, and the whole parts are not fully compiled, so some of them are incomplete. This is not pragmatically annotated, right, which is the case with most ICE corpora. And one other difference is that here they actually deviate from this 2,000 word limit per text, right? So they actually aim to include full interactions that can be longer or shorter than 2,000 words, which I found was a little bit problematic for our purposes here, but well, we just had to deal with it. So, as Patricia already explained, she found these differences in the use of directives and the choice of directive strategies along the public to private continuum, with the public genres being more polite than the more private ones. And we took that as a starting point, and we said, okay, well, let's pick 3 out of these along this continuum. So have one category, broadcast discussions, which is at the public end, then face-to-face conversations, which are on the private end, and then in between, semi-public, we have classroom discussions. And Patricia analyzed 5 texts for each category in her 2022 paper, and we followed the same approach here, and we tried to best match the speaker profiles that Patricia had in her study from 2022. So for example, for face-to-face conversations, we have quite a lot of young female speakers, so we tried to also get that from the ICE Scotland and Spice NI files. In broadcast discussions, I had to deviate a little bit because these were sometimes considerably shorter, so I included 6 rather than just 5 texts. And Patricia followed the same principle again. She applied a semi-automatic extraction method because, of course, it is annotated, so it was possible to extract, retrieve directives, and then manually classified these into directive types. I couldn't do that, right, because I didn't have pragmatic annotation, so I really manually identified and classified directives in ICE Scotland using ELAN files. Just a quick screenshot. This is what it looked like. So basically, I was listening and reading at the same time. But the good thing is that you can really see overlap and how the conversation pans out here. Our findings, right? So we are going to contrast the 3 varieties. I realize this is a little bit small. I hope you can kind of make sense of it. Basically, I'm going to walk you through this genre by genre and explain the similarities and differences between the 3 regional varieties. And we'll start off with broadcast discussions, so the most public amongst the 3 genres. So here we see actually most similarities. So we see that the blue bar at the bottom, which represents direct strategies, so mostly imperatives, is the smallest bar, right? So these are not very common in this very public genre. And this is common across all 3 regional varieties. Just a couple of examples where we actually do get them. They may even be mitigated, like just raise your hand, say your name, right? But we also have the example, but Jerry, hold on. Then we have this orange bar. These are indirect, on-record indirect statements. And among these, obligation statements are quite common. This is probably to do with the tonality of broadcasts, like with the communicative setting that we have, where there's a lot of presenter interaction. And so we have so-called nominations, like we see from Spice Ireland, Northern Ireland. Yes, you briefly Arlene. So like by calling their name, they nominate the next speaker. So that's something you get quite a lot in broadcast discussions. Right, and one thing that is a little bit different in the Southern Irish data is that we get quite a few hints, which we do not get so much in the other 2 regional varieties. So, for example, I would be keen to hear the minister's considered response, so not directly saying like, please, minister, can you reply to this, but just very indirect. Classroom discussions, the semi-public genre, here we see more differences between the data sets. The Southern Irish data actually have fewer direct strategies, imperatives than the other 2 data sets. In SPIES Northern Ireland and iScotland, these account for around 30% each. Mostly imperatives and a few performatives. So again, sometimes mitigated, like, and just write down if you've got any idea of what your action work would be, or, well then, you tell us, Charles. And a performative would be, so I strongly encourage you to go back and have a look at those ones here. And in iScotland, we actually get quite a lot of indirect statements, more than in the other varieties. That could be to do with the particular conversations that were recorded. So classroom indicates schools, but actually there are no schools. It's mostly university lectures with a lot of lecturer-centered interaction. So the lecturer is speaking much more than the actual students participating. And that could maybe explain the high number of indirect statements. So amongst these, we have instructive statements, also in the Northern Irish data. For instance, there are several other characters that probably ought to be mentioned, not so very impersonal, indirect, not targeted specifically at any participant. But we also get nominations like Keris Please in iScotland, and then want statements, volition statements. So I want you to handle these as well. And similarly, sort of combinations of suggestions in one statement. You might want to illustrate an answer, so that's quite typical of the Scottish data, so very suggestive. Right, our last genre, face-to-face conversations. So here we see a clear preference for direct strategies in the Southern Irish data, as you can see here, with a lot of imperatives. That is not so much the case in the Northern Irish and Scottish data. Where we do get them, they are more typical between interactions that are of close social distance. So, for example, mothers speaking to children, don't put that in your mouth, it's been thank you, so there are quite a few. So that maybe explains the use of imperatives here. And in iScotland, as we can see here, we get a number of less forceful on-record indirect statements. So, for instance, we've seen that one before. Why don't you get those ones, those fine ones, a suggestion, or when, and then we can go and talk to them. So again, suggestion, raising a possibility. And in the Northern Irish data, we see quite a few non-sentential strategies that we don't really see in the other data, so especially amongst friends and family. And we also see that generally there are more hints in this category than in the other ones. So obviously this face-to-face and close interaction is more favorable to hints being understood even. So we've got one example for non-sentential. Delighted to be back, I'm sure. First, like, excuse me, can you repeat this? Delighted to be back. And then a hint, I need to go because I've got work, so I really need to finish this conversation now. Right, and now I'm going to hand over to Patricia
Yes.
again.
Before we get our hints, you better finish up. Okay. So Christina has given you a rundown or an overview of the kind of strategies that we found in the different types of corpus components. And one thing that we noticed as well is that in addition to the politeness of the to the actual strategy used, there were also some additional mitigation strategies used. We only looked at the internal mitigation, even though we could have looked at the external mitigation as well, but we focused on the internal mitigation. We found that in Scotland only about a third of the strategies were mitigated for the directives, less so in the face-to-face, so they were even more direct than in the more public genres. In the classroom discussions, which are more public, a larger number, half of the directives, half of the on-record statements were mitigated. So again, we see this pattern. The more public something is, the more mitigated it's going to be. I'm sorry. Boom. So we find similar situations by Southern and Northern Ireland. We find in Northern Ireland, in the files, we looked at only one strategy, which is mitigated directives. Okay, would you hold on? And we find that the on-record statements are also mitigated, but to a very small extent. And I can see the chair getting twitchy, so I better hurry up. And where does this get us? Well, as Christina has said at the beginning, the broadcast discussions are the most public genre we looked at, so people would arguably be most concerned about attending to other people's face once. We found this indeed, and we also found that across the three corpus files we looked at, the broadcast genres are the most similar one. They are the most aligned ones. The classroom discussions and the face-to-face discussions, by contrast, we find that there is a very, very strong contextual dependence. Even though they're supposed to be the same categories, the setting makes a massive difference. Still, it's a public genre, and face threats are very largely avoided, and generally on-record indirect strategies are preferred by the speakers. However, there are a lot of directives as well, because of course teachers will go you, or you. But in Scotland we find considerable internal mitigation, which we didn't find so much in Southern or Northern Ireland. So this minimally gives us a very clear confirmation of the avoidance of public face threats in our categories.
And I'm finishing up now with the conclusion. So yes, we've done a systematic comparison of directives in similarly sampled Southern Irish, Northern Irish and Scottish English data. And so we do have to add a caveat here. So although they're similarly sampled, we do have differences in data extraction and evaluation method in Scotland, so that may be something that may account for some of the differences that we have found. But we do find that the more public the genre, the more polite the strategy. That's something that is a common denominator across our three regional varieties, and that internal modification is stronger in more public genres, in particular in the Scottish data. But at the same time, context and setting play a really important role in the choice of strategies, and that's visible across all genres. previous studies, in particular in Irish English, have worked with elicited data, so working with discourse completion tasks, right? So, and this elicits something completely different. It's like prototypical knowledge rather than what you would really say in the situation. And comparing our data to that, we really need to take that into consideration. But I think, or we think, that has to be done more and more. And I think our investigation shows clearly the need that we have to work more with naturally occurring data as we get in these corpus data. And therefore, our outlook is, let's continue, right? There's much more work to be done, and we'll have to expand on the ICE data, like work on further ICE data that we have that we've not explored, and also triangulate with elicited data. Thanks a lot.